Dr. Karen Baab, thanks so much for coming back onto Evolution Soup from your office in Arizona. You are a biological anthropologist and a professor in the Department of Anatomy at Midwestern University, Arizona, and your main interests focus on the extinct relatives of humans and what the shape of hominin skulls can tell us. In our last interviews, we talked about the famous Hobbits of Flores Island, followed by a comprehensive overview of Homo erectus. Today we'll be looking at ERECTUS yet again, but this time in a new light, all thanks to a reconstructed fossil that produced some very surprising results. Well, it's been a couple of years since you last appeared on the show, Karen. Other than rebuilding the Dan 5 fossil, what else have you been up to?
Well, I've been staying busy. So, in addition to obviously teaching anatomy, which is part of my primary responsibility here, I've had a couple other really interesting research projects I've been working on. So, one of them was to do a reconstruction of the cranium of the famous Nariocotomy boy fossil, which was already in pretty good shape, but using virtual techniques that I'll talk about later today, I was able to make some improvements on that original reconstruction of that cranium. So that was a really fun project. But also, I've been doing something, a broader project that looks actually a little bit earlier in time, nearer to the very origins of our own genus Homo, and looks at the extent to which natural selection shaped the mandible, the jaw, and the rest of the skull, related to chewing biomechanics and changes in diet. And that project really extends all the way through to the Pliocene and incorporates a much older part of the fossil record than I've worked in before. So that work is ongoing, and that's been a really fun project, but it's a little bit less directly related to the Homo erectus stuff we'll talk about today.
Karen, for anyone who is unfamiliar with Homo erectus, can you give us a brief overview of the species, its origins, migration routes, and the general scientific consensus as to where they sit on the evolutionary tree?
Sure. So, Homo erectus is an extinct hominin, which means it's on the human tree. So, it is more closely related to humans than it is to anything else that's alive. In fact, part of the Homo erectus group may even be directly ancestral to modern humans. The earliest fossils that are assigned to Homo erectus are between 1.9 and 2 million years, and they're all from Africa. But that really early part of the fossil record is pretty incomplete, or the fossils are juveniles, which comes with some particular challenges. The next geological set of fossils are actually outside of Africa in the Republic of Georgia at a site known as Dmanisi, which is a wonderfully rich site, and it has 5 cranial fossils of hominins. These are variably assigned to Homo erectus, or described as basal or very early Homo erectus, or described as being intermediate between Homo erectus and earlier Homo species, or sometimes put into their own species. So they remain a kind of a thorn in the side, but also super informative. So because of that, there are researchers who argue that the most parsimonious interpretation is that Homo erectus evolved in Africa, because we have the earliest bits belonging to that species from there. And also, the earlier Homo species that it likely evolved from are also entirely from Africa. But probably the most primitive anatomy for Homo erectus that's been recorded is from Dmanisi, from Georgia. And so there are some workers that say really a Eurasian origin is more consistent with the evidence we have. Homo erectus in general is known for having an incredibly wide geographic distribution, spanning from South Africa to East Africa and probably North Africa, and then extending through the Caucasus in Georgia as far east as China, southeast into islands of Indonesia. And then most recently, there's been a fossil in Spain, which has been described as having affinities with Homo erectus. And there's material from Turkey. So it has this incredible distribution. It's also has the longest time span of a hominin species. So I mentioned that the oldest fossils are 1.9 to 2 million years. And the youngest fossils from the island of Java in Indonesia are only 100,000 years old. So almost 2 million years of evolution. And I don't want to go into the details of this, but there are certainly workers who would prefer to split that group up into 2 or even more species. So in part, it's claim to fame and being widespread and long-lived does depend on whether you include all those fossils in that particular species. From a more technical or behavioral perspective, some of the interesting aspects of Homo erectus is that the emergence of Acheulean stone technology, which includes bifacially worked stone tools, appears to evolve during that time period. And those probably required more technological skill and may signal more complex cognition. We also see greater access and butchery of animals, and so more access to meat and other animal products in the diet, which may signal a shift to more hunting, for example. So something else that we can think about when we think about Homo erectus, in addition to that kind of healthy debate I mentioned about the African versus Eurasian origins, is questions about how Homo erectus moved across the landscape, whether there was a single migration out of Africa that expanded east and west, whether there were multiple migrations or even back migrations from Eurasia back into Africa at a later date. And the site we're going to talk about today, and I don't want to jump ahead too much, but is particularly interesting in this regard because it's located in this northeast corner of Africa. And so it's kind of in that area where you might expect to find groups that are relevant to those discussions about migration.
In the year 2000, fragments of an ancient skull were found in Gona, Ethiopia, and designated Dan 5. But it wasn't until recently that the fragments were pieced together successfully. Before we get into that reconstruction, can you take us through the discovery and describe for our audience exactly what was found?
So the Gona study area is located in the Afar region of Ethiopia, which is in the northeast part of Africa. What they have found there actually is an incredibly rich fossil and archaeological record of hominins spanning from about 6 million years ago through to much more recent times. Fossil discoveries there include some of the oldest evidence of Oldowan and Acheulean stone technology. And in 2020, they announced the discovery of 2 sites within Gona. They were close by sites, and they included at both sites fossil evidence of Homo erectus and evidence of both Oldowan and Acheulean stone tools. So the people that head up the Gona study project are Seleshi Sima and Mike Rogers. And they're both archaeologists, and they were both really excited to see evidence of a single species most likely making both types of stone tools. But as a paleoanthropologist, as a morphologist, I was really excited to see that there were fossils of Homo erectus. So the Dan 5 fossil that they described had a fairly complete skull cap or brain case or neurocranium. And it also had some fragments that they showed of the maxilla and teeth. So the maxilla is the upper jaw. There was also a second site, which I mentioned, and it also had some fragmentary bits of the top of the brain case of a separate, different Homo erectus individual that was about 250,000 years younger. So when I saw this publication in 2020, which was the result of field work they had been doing for about 10 years since, or maybe about 20 years since the year 2000. I reached out and I already knew Celestia and Mike because we're collaborating on a totally separate project at Gona. And I said, I would love to get involved with these fossils. I have a comparative data set of Homo erectus crania already, and I would love to see how they compare. And they were on board. So I started by doing a fairly simple virtual reconstruction just of that skull cap for Dan 5, which was already pretty complete, so that wasn't too challenging. But the second fossil was much more fragmentary. There was just, I think, 4 major pieces. And once I was able to piece those together correctly using virtual techniques that I'll talk about in a second, it yielded one side of the top of the brain case. So virtual reconstruction techniques take 3D models of either individual bones or fragments and bits and pieces of bones, depending on how they're found. And after CT scanning or surface scanning, you can make them into little 3D models on your computer screen. And then you can manipulate them in the computer programs that are designed for this and piece them together almost like a 3D puzzle. And I'm making it sound really simple, but it's not, because while you have an idea of how that puzzle is going to come out, in the sense that you have knowledge of cranial anatomy, for example, you don't know the exact details for that individual, and there's always missing pieces. So it's a challenging process, but it's also very satisfying if you like puzzles like I do. So after I reconstructed the 2 brain cases, I did a shape-based analysis comparing them to other Homo erectus and early Homo fossils from Africa, from Asia, from Georgia. And what I found is that they looked most like other African Homo erectus fossils, but Dan 5 at least did have some kind of slightly unusual features as well. One thing I would note is that the Dan 5 fossil has a pretty small brain size. In fact, it's the smallest brained fossil assigned to Homo erectus in Africa. It overlaps Homo habilis, an earlier, a less derived, more primitive species in Africa. Its brain size also overlaps that Georgian outpost that I talked about earlier. So that's quite interesting. But there are also distinct features on that cranial vault that we typically associate with Homo erectus. It has a really projecting brow ridge and kind of a little groove behind that called a sulcus. It has a ridge of bone on the side of the skull called an angular torus. And it has a little bit of keeling, or kind of a heaping up of bone along the midline. All of those are features that we associate, like I said, with Homo erectus. So it's got a small brain for an African fossil in that species, but it has these traits that we think link it to that species. So we published that study in 2022.
In 2025, you and your team digitally reconstructed the fragments of the Dan 5 cranium. Karen, could you describe for us the timeline of this reconstruction and why using digital technology was so useful?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, I got involved with the Dan 5 project in particular in 2020, but at the time I was really focused just on the cranial vault. But when I looked back at the different scans that the Gona team had sent me, I realized that they had also sent me the different fragments of the face that they had. So that included the right and left half of the upper jaw, the maxilla, which they had also visualized in the original publication. It included individual teeth, so the fossil includes both premolars and all 3 molars, so all the teeth behind the canine. And then it also included, quite interestingly, a part of the cheek that's right below the eye and kind of bordering the nasal cavity. And then a smaller piece that's the lateral side, or the side of the orbit, the bone that kind of wraps around where your eye is. And I took a really careful look at these pieces and I started thinking that these might all link up. It's conceivable that the face had just kind of fragmented in place and we were picking up the individual pieces, but that they were all relatively complete. Um, and it turned out ultimately that that was the case, but it took quite a while to determine that was in fact what had happened. So one thing I'll also mention is that I have seen these fossils in person in Addis in the museum, the National Museum of Ethiopia. But there are some disadvantages to trying to do the reconstruction physically, which means taking the original fossils and gluing them together. Doing it virtually on a computer screen is less destructive, but also it allows you to do multiple different versions and compare them and see which ones seem to be more accurate. It also allows you to do really cool things that you just can't do with a physical copy, like take an individual piece and mirror it to the other side. So maybe you have the right or the left side of the cheek. Now you can swap those and fill in missing areas. One of the pieces that they had scanned, there was a chunk that had kind of broken off at some point during its taphonomic or fossilization history, and then it had gotten re-cemented back on in the wrong place. But by using the other side, I could separate that off and reposition it correctly. Those are things that are much harder to do with the physical fossil. So those are all the really kind of high-level reasons that a virtual reconstruction was a good choice for this project. But for me personally, it also allowed me to work from the comfort of my office and take as long as I needed to without having the constraints of only being able to do it at the museum where the original fossils were held. So the process took me probably over a year. I mean, not 8 hours a day every day, but it took a lot of time. The way that you do this is you take the individual pieces and you have to figure out what are all the anatomical constraints, what are all the kind of rules you have to follow for it to be physically possible, and hope that that's enough to give you basically one outcome and not 10. Ultimately, I felt that the reconstruction I did was the best possible arrangement of those pieces. But that doesn't mean that someone else might not come along in 5 years and say, I think that we can do a different configuration that is better. By doing it virtually, they have the freedom to do that. We can treat each reconstruction as a kind of a hypothesis. So here is the reconstruction that I ultimately put together. So let's see. This part here is the brain case. This is the part that's surrounding where the brain would be inside. And that was the part that I had worked on previously and we had published in 2022. This shows the different pieces of the face. So we have the right and left maxilla, the left part of the cheek that goes next to the nasal cavity and kind of borders part of the orbit, and that smaller piece that forms the rest of that circular orbit. And if I turn it so you can see the base or the bottom of it, we can see the different teeth that have been positioned kind of in their little sockets where possible, or just kind of almost hanging in space where there weren't any sockets preserved. So this is a wonderful reconstruction. This shows it without having duplicated and mirrored all the additional pieces, but we also have a version of the reconstruction where we've done that full mirroring as well. So with my own data set, I was able to do a shape analysis of the entire cranium that I just showed you. And that showed us that in its overall cranial shape, it was most like Georgian Homo erectus and some, but not all, African Homo erectus. But I knew I wasn't capturing all the details. So the way my analysis works is I have individual three-dimensional landmarks positioned at different locations. And they cover the whole area, but they're not a very dense concentration. So in order to do a more detailed analysis of the face itself, which was really the new part of this study, I called on a colleague, Sarah Friedline at the University of Central Florida. And she's an expert in doing these dense analyses of face shape, very detailed analyses. And she already has her own wonderful data set that she was able to kind of plug this fossil into. I also called on my colleague Yasuki Kaifu from the University of Tokyo, who's an expert on tooth anatomy in early Homo and Homo erectus, and he provided more detailed, high-resolution analyses of tooth size, proportions, and shape. So the three of us together were able to bring a lot of information to bear on trying to understand how this particular fossil fits into the broader evolutionary tree. I want to say that this project was particularly exciting for me because it was really my first opportunity to be kind of at the ground floor of a new fossil description. While not all of the fossil was new, putting together the face and then putting it onto the neurocranium, that hadn't been done for this fossil. And I was really excited to be part of that process. And so we published this study in December, just before the holiday, so fairly recently.
Karen, does this mean that researchers will be looking at their physical reconstructions and thinking, hang on, this might be wrong. Maybe we should redo everything digitally?
Well, that's a great question. And we are seeing more and more virtual reconstructions. So in many cases, newer fossils that are coming out of the ground, there's usually some amount of physical reconstruction done. If there's 3 or 4 fragments that clearly form a single bone, that might be done in the lab. But then there might be areas where it's less clear how we fit them together. And I'm seeing more and more studies published that are using these techniques. It's also the case that, as I mentioned earlier, I went back and kind of reevaluated the physical reconstruction of the Nariocotomy boy or Turkana boy cranium and improved on that original reconstruction. I've also seen that happening. So there is a fossil calvaria or neurocranium from Ciprano, and there have been several attempts at reconstruction, both physical and virtual. And the idea is that we're trying to improve on this, and there are certain tools we can use doing virtual reconstruction that are just not feasible with physical reconstruction. I can also take apart things that have been glued together sometimes and fix them a little bit if I think the original job wasn't quite as good as it could be. But again, I think we have to view each of these reconstructions as a kind of hypothesis. And they should be associated with careful descriptions of the steps that were taken, the decisions that were made, and the justification for that, so that readers can evaluate the validity of that presented reconstruction. And that's one of the things that we did in our paper. There's a supplemental information that goes through in great detail the different anatomical constraints that we considered when positioning each of the pieces, where we thought there was the most confidence and where we thought there was some uncertainty. So in fact, we actually presented a second reconstruction that just reoriented the face slightly on the neurocranium based on a possible different interpretation, and showed that it didn't really affect our ultimate conclusions, but it does speak to the fact that reconstructions are not always definitive. If it's found and it's really complete and you can see where everything fits together, great, but that's not always the case.
So, what does this reconstruction reveal about this Homo erectus skull?
So one thing I want to point out is this is the first really complete cranium of an early Pleistocene Homo fossil from Northeast Africa, from Ethiopia. It's only the 6th from Africa in general. So every fossil is so precious, and the more complete they are, the more information they provide. So I thought there were some really interesting observations we made as soon as we had the complete picture from the cranial, facial, and dental analyses. So one thing we noticed is that the face and teeth present more ancestral, or what some people might call primitive, features than what we saw in the cranial vault. We know the brain is small, but there were a lot of features on the vault that were very typical Homo erectus. We see a few of those in the face and the teeth as well, but also more traits that we typically think of as being early Homo or Homo habilis-like. So a few examples. Features we think of as being Homo erectus-like on the face include this kind of groove right here called the maxillary sulcus. We also have this canine jugum, which is kind of like the way that the bone bulges out around the root of the canine tooth. We also see that the palate depth, how deep the hard palate is, the roof of your mouth, those features strike us as being fairly Homo erectus-like. But if we look at the face, we also see that it's really flat across the cheek area. And that's not what you typically see in African Homo erectus. You see that more in Homo habilis. The area around the root of the nose is not projecting, which again, typical African Homo erectus tend to have a projecting nasal region. It's maybe hard to see on the video, but there's this area of the bone that kind of comes up and starts to form the cheek. It's coming off the palate. That is further forward than what we typically see in Homo erectus, and again, kind of harkens back to earlier Homo species. If we look at the teeth, we see that the third molar, what we call the wisdom tooth, is quite large. The typical trend in Homo erectus is for the molars to get smaller, and particularly that third molar, and we don't see that in Dan5. And so those are some features. In addition, the shape of the premolars and the shape of the third molar are also more early Homo-like than Homo erectus-like. So we're seeing this incredible kind of mishmash of derived typical Homo erectus traits and more ancestral early Homo traits. And this is the first fossil we see this combination of features in from Africa. Where we see this typically is that site in Georgia, which has always been taxonomically ambiguous because of that kind of blurring of the boundaries. And now we're picking up that anatomy here in Africa. But maybe surprisingly, it's not as ancient. So the site in Georgia is about 1.8 million years old. The stone tools extend back even a little bit further. The fossil here from the Dan5 fossil here from Ethiopia is 1.5 to 1.6 million years. So that's an interesting set of features at this time period. And we see a pretty clear contrast between this fossil and other African fossils that are contemporaneous from 1.5 or 1.6 million years ago. And so we see this important variation as well.
How does this discovery reshape our perspective on Homo erectus?
Great question. So as I just mentioned, we're seeing a surprising level of variation, I think, within Africa itself. And there are a couple of different possible interpretations. So the primary interpretation that we offered in our study is that we are observing population level variation, meaning this is one species, including sites here in Gona and sites further south in Kenya around the Turkana Basin and Lake Turkana region, but that there are distinctions in these two areas. So these are all kind of part of this East African Rift Valley system. And there's these kind of basins that form in the Rift Valley. And potentially this has generated some periods of isolation where these two groups, even though they're in the same species, are not interacting. Perhaps one interpretation is that we had this migration of Homo erectus out of Africa around, let's say, 1.9 million years. We pick it up again up here in Georgia. Some of that group that was kind of migrating out remained behind in Gona, in Ethiopia, and just didn't really undergo a lot of evolutionary change between 1.9 and when we find Dan5 at 1.5 million years. So 400,000 years, minimal change. In contrast, the group of Homo erectus that was down in the area around Kenya may have undergone more rapid evolutionary change in that same time period. And so now you have these bigger brained, smaller toothed, more modern faced populations down around Kenya at sites like Kubifora Westerkana. At the same time, further north at Gona, we have something with a smaller brain and larger teeth and a less modern looking face. And so that may be what we're picking up here. There are other possible interpretations. We really have one data point right now, and that always makes it tricky. That always leaves open other interpretations. But the other interpretations are also quite interesting. So let's touch on those as well. So for example, it may be that what we're picking up is actually a back migration. So maybe there was this early migration around 1.9 or 2 million years from Africa up into Eurasia. Things continued on, but then some of those hominins up here in Eurasia migrated back down into Africa. In the meantime, African Homo erectus was undergoing evolutionary change, and now the contrast is explained differently. What we're actually seeing is basically a Eurasian outpost that's migrated down back into Africa compared to the kind of native African Homo erectus that had stayed there and undergone its own kind of trajectory for, maybe 4 or 500, for a longer period of time, actually. A third interpretation that would be interesting is the idea that we might be looking at inbreeding. So we know that in later human evolutionary history, Neanderthals, the so-called Denisovans, they interbred with modern humans as modern humans were migrating out across Europe and Asia. And they picked up genetic and potentially other features, phenotypic physical features from these groups throughout that migration. Maybe we're actually seeing a kind of interbreeding between a more Homo habilis-like species that was present perhaps in Gona and Homo erectus, or again, that same idea of a back migration, but then interbreeding on top of that. That might explain that mix of more derived, but also more archaic or ancestral features present in this individual fossil or in this population as a whole. So those are all interesting potential interpretations. Surely there's researchers out there who would offer other additional ideas about what this might mean, but it certainly highlights both greater diversity of this group within Africa and a more complex pattern of evolution of these traits we've been talking about. So reduction of tooth size, expansion of the brain, changes in the structure of the skull and the face. They are not appearing as a integrated suite of traits that all kind of appear at a moment in time, evolutionarily speaking. Instead, we're seeing this kind of piecemeal evolution, sometimes called mosaic evolution, of these traits. So if we look at the Dan5 fossil, it could signal changes like the very projecting brow ridge, the presence of this angular torus at the back of the skull, the torus or a lump of bone across the back of the skull. These Homo erectus-like features may have appeared earlier evolutionarily, whereas many of the facial and dental features didn't emerge until later. And we can even link that to some of the behavioral and technological innovations that we know characterize Homo erectus. So at both Gona and Dmanisi, we have this small-brained hominin species with some Homo erectus features, but certainly not the full suite, not the brain expansion that we anticipate. Not all members of these groups have the smaller teeth. There's a bit of a mix in Georgia. And yet, we also find evidence at both sites for a broadening of the dietary niche, meaning they're eating a more diverse set of foods. We also see kind of a tendency to eat more meat, and we see the presence of Acheulean tools at Gona, all of which seem to be preceding that full suite of Homo erectus-like traits. So a kind of disassociation or disconnect between some of the behavioral and morphological traits that we associate with this species. So that's also another kind of interesting implication. We don't have any bones for the Dan 5 individual below the head, no postcranial fossils, we call those. And so it's a little bit hard, a little bit tricky to estimate the body size for this individual. There have been a few studies that have tried to use dimensions or measurements around the orbit as a way of getting at body size. And when we do that, we see that Dan 5 is probably smaller in its body size than contemporaneous African Homo erectus. It's more similar, again, to what we see at Georgia. And so, again, some of these behavioral and technological innovations are also occurring before that jump in body size that we think of for fossils like Turkana who's quite large. So these are all interesting implications. The final one I want to touch on is another fossil species called Homo naledi. This is a species that is found exclusively in South Africa right now. It comes from Middle Pleistocene cave sites that are dated to about 300,000 years, so more than 1,000,000 years later than Dan 5. So I want to be clear on that. It's geographically and temporally distant. But both of the fossils representing Homo naledi and Dan 5 retain the smaller brain through time, and they retain some other features that we might think of as being more ancestral or more primitive, and certain even distinct similarities between the two that I think are quite intriguing. I'm not willing to go out on a limb and say this is an ancestor for Homo naledi, but I think there's some interesting resemblances that need further investigation.
Well, it's very impressive work that you and your team have done. No doubt these new revelations will spark a lot of conversation within the scientific community. So, what other projects are you working on at the moment that you can tell us about?
Great question. So, just in the same way that this Gona project was a very collaborative project, nearly all the work I'm doing right now is the result of other wonderful international collaborations. So, I'm doing other projects at Gona that are unrelated to the Dan 5 and other Homo erectus fossils. They're a little more recent in time, and they are also super interesting. I'm hopeful that at least one of those is going to come to fruition in the next year, so maybe I can come back and talk about that sometime. I'm also heading up a different, distinct collaboration with folks working at Drummelin, which is a site in South Africa. So the Drummelin site's quite interesting because, again, in 2020, they described a juvenile, not entirely complete, but pretty nicely preserved neurocranium or cranial vault, and it was a juvenile fossil from 2 million years ago, which is like the very earliest time range of Homo erectus, and they indeed attributed this fossil to Homo erectus. And they further suggested that even as an adult, this juvenile would have had quite a small brain size. And so that was another interesting Homo erectus discovery in 2020. And I also reached out to that group, some of whom I already knew. And I said, I think we can do more with this fossil. We can look at it in a developmental context based on the shape of its calvaria. We can think about brain evolution. And so that's an ongoing project that is starting to wrap up. So hopefully that will get submitted for publication, and I can also talk about that some other time. So that's a really great project that I'm working on. And then I'm continuing this work that I mentioned earlier in the presentation or earlier in our interview, which was about looking for signals of natural selection related to chewing biomechanics. And we've been doing a lot of that work so far, the kind of foundational work, looking at humans, chimpanzees, gorillas, kind of proxies for hominins. But we're about to move into the work that's going to incorporate fossils much more heavily. So I'm really looking forward to that as well.
Dr. Karen Baab, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to be here again.